Ding with white switches away from the English opening he played against Nepo and lost with earlier in the tournament. Instead, we see a Grunfeld defense chosen by Rapport. The idea of this opening is that white has built a strong center, but black's pieces are placed to pressure. Both sides continue to develop. Bishop b5 hints maybe white will take that knight to remove some of the pressure. Ding decides not to quite yet, though. At this point, we are pretty much at the end of the opening stage. White has all of their pieces developed, so can you come up with a plan for white? Ding plays h4. He sees that Rapport's king only has one defender, the bishop on g7, and is otherwise feeling quite lonely, so he decides to trade off some of the pawns in front of Rapport's king to soften it up. Bishop g5 hits the rook. Rapport decides, though, he's not going to deal with that threat. He's going to sacrifice that rook. His idea, the bishop on g7 is now unopposed. White doesn't have a dark squared bishop to counter it and will be very strong. Ding continues with his attack, h5. He doesn't care that his bishop on b5 is hanging. He doesn't care that Rapport's rook is staring right at his queen. He realizes that black's having trouble moving that knight without losing their rook. He now secures his bishop on b5. This position, Ding makes a spectacular move. He realizes that black's knight can move away as long as there's a check. So in order to prevent black's knight from moving, he plays king f1, getting off of any potential checks. It's quite a difficult move to see in advance because no one's thinking about moving their king here, but that's what makes Ding such a strong player. The problem, though, is that after Rapport takes, he doesn't follow through on his idea. His whole point was that now he doesn't have to take the knight, but could take the rook, and this would have given him a winning position. Black can take two different pieces if they take the rook. Then Ding would have very strong move queen g5, attacking black's bishop and setting up all sorts of mating attacks. For instance, queen takes e4 immediately gets back rank mated. If Rapport instead tried to take the pawn on e4, after bishop takes e2, black gets a few checks, but once white's king runs out into the center, it will be white's turn to start the counterattack, even though it feels like their king's wide out in the open, white has enough pieces near it to keep it alive, which gave away a lot of his winning chances. It was a big miss by Ding. We see some trades now where Rapport picks up the center pawn. Ding brings the queen back. Here, Ding makes one more mistake, which removes the rest of his winning chances. Can you find how to keep the game going for white? The important idea here is that white should be aiming for a queen trade. Therefore, white can play queen e4. The idea is that black cannot accept this queen trade. Black's b6 pawn is too weak, will be lost without the queen to defend it, and white will promote their a pawn. Instead, if black declines the queen trade, though, then the queen has been removed from the defense of the bishop, and white would have very strong move queen f3. Their threat is that if it's white's turn, what can they do? If it's white's turn, they would play h6, force the king to take, and then black's bishop on f6 would drop. Consequently, black is forced to make a concession near their king, whether it be g5 or g takes h5. Either way, now white can combine pressure against black's b6 pawn and against their king, and Ding would have retained winning chances. Instead of queen e4, he starts by taking this pawn, but that was an important asset that he could not afford to give away. The position is drawn as long as suddenly it is actually black who creates a winning chance. One chance, because once Ding sees the checkmate, he stops it. Now Ding finally ends the game by trading and forcing a perpetual. The bishop on d4 was anchored and was way too strong. There weren't any winning chances anyway. The game ends in a draw. Ding going to be very upset with this game. He had some big chances. He played some amazing moves, but he couldn't follow up on his ideas and find the knockout against Rapport, letting him get away. Our game between Radjabov and Nepo was not particularly eventful as we followed established Catalan theory for quite a number of moves. Nepo opts for a different system than he used in the match with Carlsen, which leads to an early endgame. The question is how to deal with the c4 pawn that is hanging. What would you do here? The important thing is, first of all, to realize that b5 is inadvisable because you have opened up white's Catalan bishop and will be punished after knight e5. Your knight's hanging. If you move it, you lose your rook. Instead, Nepo makes the move pawn to c3. After takes, white's pawns are split. This is a structure that we've actually seen before in the tournament. The downside for black is the bishop on c8 is still locked in. After more developing moves by both sides, Nepo fixes the problem of his bishop by trading it off. The pawn structure, though, has become completely symmetrical. After the knight and bishop are traded off, we see the game head into a dead drawn position in this rook endgame with a symmetrical pawn structure. The game between Caruana and Duda is another game that goes into an endgame relatively early on, as a knight or Fabi goes for the English attack. At this point, Duda plays h5, stopping Fabi from playing g4 and starting a kingside attack. Both sides develop. At this point, Fabi finally jumps his knight into the center. After some trades, Duda goes after this pawn. Fabi takes off that knight, plays knight a5, rook c8. The knight goes into c6, where the knight looks very strong, but it will not last there because of Duda's next move. Knight takes d5, forcing this knight to move since it's now hanging. So knight takes c7, knight takes, trades. We've reached this endgame. We'll make a couple more moves, both sides bringing out their pieces. At this point, my question for you is, how would you evaluate this endgame? Both sides here have some advantages. White's main advantage is the bishop against the knight. In general, bishops coordinate better with the rook than the knight does. So usually a rook and bishop is better than a rook and knight. Additionally, white has some potential play on the queen side. There's a 3 versus 2 pawn majority over here, and these pawns on a6 and b5 are potentially vulnerable after white goes for some kind of a4 move or a c4 move in the future. On the other hand, though, black has their own advantages, namely the 4-pawn majority on this side of the board and the fact that their king is in the center where it will be well placed to help push those pawns, leading to an evaluation of around equality here. In the game, not much more happened. Eventually, black was able to fix this knight and was able to actually bring this knight around as such, forcing Fabi's bishop back. Once the rooks were traded, there weren't much winning chances left. The game between Firouzja and Nakamura was actually their first time playing an in-person, long time control game. It was a Nimzo Indian where black parts with the bishop pair, but is able to start gaining some time attacking white's pieces. Firouzja now brings the queen back and starts to build a big center. Here's where things start to get interesting. Nakamura deprives Firouzja of the right to castle, leaving white's king in the center, but quickly it becomes Naka's king that is under fire. After g5, Firouzja, do you think he's going to move this bishop back? Do you think he's going to do that? Knight takes pawn, going for the piece sacrifice to open up black's king. After takes, bishop takes g5. The other problem for black here is that this pin is deadly. Black has to be very careful about how they deal with this pin. Naka plays knight c6, and here, can you find a way to add another attacker to this knight? The first thing is that the move e5 would add another attacker, but now black plays knight takes d4, starts to make counterattacks against your queen. Once the queen moves away somewhere, now, for example here, now your queen would be in the line of your rook, so then knight f5, the attack continues. This position, white is not going to have time to grab this knight because of the amount of attack they're under. Instead, Firouzja plays queen c1. Now white has the idea of playing queen f4 to add pressure to the knight, and also rook lifting, rook d3, rook g3 coming in next. That inspires Nakamura's next move, rook takes d4 to trade those rooks. Trade, queen f4, knight c2. Now we see a series of checks by Nakamura, getting off the pin, check, grabbing the pawn. Here we go. We have reached this endgame. Material is now back to even after Firouzja's earlier sacrifice. And another one where I would like you to evaluate this endgame. Once you evaluate the endgame, also come up with a plan for white. Here we see two reasons why white can claim an advantage. First of all, as we discussed with the game between Caruana and Duda, the rook and bishop tend to be better than the rook and knight. The other reason is that white is the only side with a passed pawn. Namely, this outside pass to h-pawn will give Firouzja winning chances. Nakamura, though, is not one to go down easily, one of the most stubborn defenders on the planet. After we see white start this plan, they've got to push the passed pawns to h4. Let's go. Knight centralizes now for Nakamura. Both sides pushing some pawns, activating their king, using all of their pieces. Now it's Nakamura's turn to start pushing his own pawns. Both sides going for it as the pawns march up the board. Naka's king has been forced back, and things start to look like they're not going his way. But again, Nakamura plays some incredible defense to survive this game. The rooks are now traded. Firouzja brings in his bishop, attacking the pawn on a5, so Naka pushes it. Now g5, king f7, h7, here, here. Naka cannot take the g6 pawn because the h pawn will promote. But at this point, Nakamura starts to find an important defensive idea. The point is that in a lot of these types of positions, you have better drawing chances if you can trade off some pawns. By trading off the pawns, you reduce the number of pawns that your opponent will have to queen with. So c3, the first trade, and bringing in the knight. Now the knight goes back. Bishop g5, the knight had to be prevented from going here and taking the pawn. Now black starts to push. Black is sitting for a bit. Finally, Nakamura finishes off the game, forcing it into a draw by trading off some more pawns. b4, take, take. Now white's bishop is forced to come back to defend, giving Nakamura time to take this one and bring the knight back to go take the rest of the pawns, leaving this game at a draw. This one definitely looked scary for Nakamura at points. The thing is, though, Nakamura was able to play some incredible defense to keep this game together. Well, after a day of all draws, the standings don't exactly change. Therefore, we've got Fabi and Nepomniachtchi still in first place with 2 out of 3. Duda, Firouzja, Rapport, and Nakamura all at 1.5. Radjabov and Ding are still at the bottom with 1 point out of 3. As we're heading into our first rest day, let me know in the comments whose play you've been most impressed with in the first few games. Other than that, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and share this video.